We have another headline out of Detroit, and this intrigued me. Nation's Dope Kingpin Seized in Detroit Raids. The Old Man. So there was a guy, Giuseppe Catalanotte, widely known as the Old Man, was arrested in a series of raids, so netted more than $100,000 worth of H. Known as Cockeyed Joe Catalanotte, his arrest records back to 1923. Testimony before the Senate Crime Investigating Committee has it that the kingpin of narcotics in the country at this time in the early 50s was Giuseppe Catalanotte. So why would, in the very early 50s and aftermath of World War II, would have Detroit had the, and of course the papers are gonna, and the feds don't know everything that's going on, but why would it even have been possible? Detroit Mafia families are from a certain part of Sicily. Trapani, Tiracini, and Castellamare del Golfo was in between those. And of course, you mob aficionados know in the early 30s there was the Castellamares War. The families that made up the Detroit Mafia were closely linked with these families from Castellamare del Golfo, especially the Banano family, which was always heavily into heroin. And also there was another, the family of Gaetano Badalamenti lived down in Monroe, Michigan, which isn't far from Detroit. And that ended up being the Pizza Connection. Those were Sicilians that were in the United States for decades and decades that had a parallel heroin smuggling thing going on that was kind of separate from what the Italian Mafia was doing. And Giuseppe Catalanotte, Cockeyed Joe, his brother had been Sam, Singing Sam Catalanotte, who briefly in like 1928, 29, 30 had been the head of what would become, well, it wasn't the Detroit Mafia family yet because the families didn't start till 1931, but he was the most powerful of the Italians. He died of pneumonia, oddly enough, and his brother went on, Giuseppe Catalanotte, went on to be a big player in the early heroin business, and it was coming in through Canada, and at this time, coming out of World War II, Detroit had been the arsenal of democracy, and it was the single area of the country with the most produced goods, obviously, right? The auto industry was there the most. It was the epicenter of heavy industry, and it was the home of the Teamsters. And when I found out that in the late 40s and probably by early 50s, it was shifting to New York. But for a few years, right out of the late 40s and early 1951 too, maybe, Detroit, New York mobsters were coming to Detroit to get their supply, at least briefly, or some of it. And the Teamsters were part of this. Jimmy Hoffa, I don't think, we may be familiar with in the movie Kill the Irishman, or The Irishman. He wouldn't have been per se knowingly participating in a particular crime, but he gave two Detroit mobsters their own Teamsters logo to be the officers of, and there really wasn't much that went on at this Teamsters logo. It just gave these two guys free reign. Now, what's also interesting, here's a clip from a black Detroit newspaper at the time. Credit detectives for largest haul. Arrest by pair dooms dope ring. Cooperation of messenger leads police to kingpin in New York. So this is about two black detectives in the early 50s. Franks and, I think Franks and Williams. And then there was a third brought in, a guy named Marzette. And these three black detectives were used all around the Midwest in the early 50s to infiltrate. These were three black detectives out of Detroit. They were used to infiltrate heroin rings and probably marijuana and cocaine rings around the East Coast and the whole Midwest. And they were very, very effective. They were very famous. And then in the mid-50s, they got arrested. They, in fact, had turned into dealers. And Henry Marzette, which I talk about, and there's a whole nother big story, Henry Marzette may have been the first black kingpin in the country at all, even before people in New York, because we've been told he owned land in Cuba before Castro took power. So that would have been the late 50s that he would have amassed enough money. And he certainly was running big dope by the mid-50s. He used his time infiltrating the drug rings around the country to also set up his own drug ring with national scope and with international supply. Marzette, circa 1970 or so, made a play to take over in Detroit, and he told the dealers that he had coming in that he was actually going to be growing opium somewhere in the Bahamas, which is pretty wild. And one kind of important side note to this, or not side note, is really central because it's very important. Congressional hearings, of course, about drugs in the early 50s. Things didn't really pick up a bunch of steam into the early 60s, but this drug culture that burst upon the country in the late 60s, early 70s obviously didn't come out of nowhere. The Vietnam War, which we're going to end this piece on, so many guys came back addicted from that. It pushed the heroin trade to another level. So again, our government's war in letting our allies in the South Korean government sell to our own troops, who then brought their addictions back, helped create the drug culture of the late 60s and early 70s that never went away, right? That ebbed and flowed, then it turned into the networks of people that distributed the cocaine. It turned into the crack era, which then they kind of, we didn't hear about drugs as much. And then, of course, but it's all the pump was primed. America was, these drug networks were set up really after World War II, and they would ebb and flow, but the pump was primed by crooked police, by things like the Teamsters, or not the Teamsters as a whole, but Mafia infiltration of the Teamsters, the biggest transportation network in the country, corrupt black police, of course, lots of corrupt white federal officers, and the highest level of mafioso. So there were big-time people in every aspect of society involved in this very lucrative business all along. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. But who was the real loser in this? Well, it's the overall, more than anything, the general black community. And I don't just mean if a person chooses to use drugs or sell, they take what comes with that. But here, let's listen to the testimony of a white prostitute, con woman, heroin addict from the very early 50s. Well, said the girl with the matter-of-fact manner of a housewife revealing a cookie recipe, the idea is to get a man in a place where you can drink privately, make a lot of promises, and then put knockout drops in his drink. He's out for about 9 hours, then I take his money. Then what? Then I'm gone. I've gotten up to $1,600 at one time. I've done it in Pittsburgh. This is the early 50s. $1,600 then is like $20,000 now. Done it in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit, New York. The girl's account of procuring drugs in a strange city was revealing, if not inspiring. You head for the colored district and find another addict. You simply go sit in a bar and observe the people that come in. You always find somebody. So already in the early 1950s, a white drug addict, this criminal woman, it was known you could just go into any black neighborhood and kind of wouldn't take long. You'll make eye contact with somebody and you could get, like in Detroit, you get 3 capsules of cocaine for $10, 2 of heroin. 3 for 10 cocaine, 1 for 5 heroin. And this is 1951, 52. So this is my premise that I talk about, and I premised it really by understanding that when you you study the drug trade in the United States, you find out that immediately after World War II, well, even before, but everything was broken up during World War II. But the black neighborhoods were made into the crime zone, the central distribution point, the places where prostitution could be and drugs could be sold. So no wonder a lot of black people got caught up in this idea of the street life. They had less opportunities in the regular economy, and they were being born in neighborhoods where the political system itself had set up the drug business and the gambling business and the prostitution business. So just some quick rough account of a lot of interesting and important activities from the middle part of the century that happened long before all this wild stuff we hear about in the age of Frank Matthews and Nicky Barnes and Frank Lucas and Eddie Jackson and all of that. Al Prophet. Check out these clips from Killing Jimmy Hoffa, Cold War Heroin Heat, and some added stuff. One of the most stunning claims about Hoffa and the Teamsters is that they were integral to the development of the global heroin trade. Teamster trucks and locals may have been used to help flood the United States with Sicilian heroin in the aftermath of World War II. And it all centered around Hoffa's first friend in the mob, Frank Coppola.
A number of congressional committee reports documented the relationship between Coppola and Hoffa and the Teamsters. Now, Coppola is a really interesting character. He's a bootlegger in Los Angeles. He's a human trafficker in Mexico. He's a labor racketeer in Detroit. He's running drugs out of Cuba. He's all over the place. The United States deports Coppola in 1948. Communist Party is popular in Italy. The labor unions are gaining strength in Italy. And the U.S. State Department has a very real concern that Italy will fall into communist hands. And back in Sicily, he's a political power broker. He has unique connections to Italian senators. His brother is a powerful member of the clergy in Sicily.
Even before the Nazis surrendered, the Cold War was beginning, and the U.S. government was making deals with criminals and former fascists in Europe to help fight a dirty war against communism. In Italy, this was known as Operation Gladio. Mafia boss of bosses Lucky Luciano was working with the U.S. government, and so was Jimmy Hoffa's old friend, Frank Coppola.
Coppola and Luciano got together and created a drug network. From Montreal, there were two routes. One was straight south into New York, where it was handled by a guy from the Banano crime family, a guy named Carmine Galante. And then across Canada, over the Detroit River into Detroit.
Congressional committee reports identified Preziola and Quasarano as two of the most significant and important drug traffickers in North America.
And Jimmy Hoffa, in order to give these guys a facade of legitimacy, he set up a dummy local for them, Teamsters local for them to operate out of.
And the evidence suggests that for quite some time, New York mafiosi were buying their heroin from the Detroit suppliers. Did Hoffa know about the narcotics trafficking? I can't prove that. I suspect that someone as smart as Hoffa would not want to know about what was going on. But I've interviewed retired federal agents from FBN, and they contend that within their offices, it was well known that the Teamsters were protecting these drug traffickers.
Italian elections of 1947 had been good to the Communist Party, and the elections of 1948 were shaping up to be even better. But there was no way that American corporate interests would let Italian workers choose to go communist, as that would threaten the capitalist system at its core. So men like Frank Coppola did the dirty work and reaped the benefits of protection for their criminal pursuits in return. The Italian voters, recently freed from the tyranny of fascism by the Americans, were now to be subjected to the tyranny of democracy by the Americans.
Frank Coppola was probably involved in covering up one of the most disturbing acts of political violence in post-war Western Europe. On May 1st, 1947, Sicilian villagers gathered at the village of Portella di Ginestra for their International Labor Day celebration when they were attacked with volleys of gunfire. The culprit was the infamous bandit Salvatore Giuliano, the Robin Hood of Sicily. 11 villagers were left dead, including several young children, and of course, public sentiment turned against Giuliano, and he was hunted by thousands of Italian carabinieri. Journalists and astute observers of the day quickly figured out that right-wing political elements, likely with the prompting and help of the American government, who had actually installed numerous mafiosos as mayors and bureaucrats across Sicily and the mainland, were behind the massacre. By 1950, when the trial of the bandits began, Frank Coppola was back in Sicily, and he was one of the most powerful mafioso there, and his heroin smuggling to Detroit was in full swing. The Sicilian Robin Hood, Giuliano, had been murdered by his right-hand man, Gaspare Pisciata, while he slept. And when Pisciata began threatening to tell who was really behind the massacre, he was poisoned in prison. Over the next 20 years, nearly every bandit and many of the prosecutors and politicians involved with the infamous were themselves murdered. The full truth of the Porta della Ginestra will never be known, but Frank Coppola is suspected by many in the know to have orchestrated the cover-up in the aftermath of the crime itself on behalf of the CIA. To quote Sicilian bandit and murderer Gaspare Pisciata, "We are one body, bandits, police, and mafia, like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit."
Sent a Freedom of Information Act request to CIA for Coppola. They turned me down. It's not, their files on Coppola are not declassified.
With the CIA, the American military, and corrupt political forces in Italy providing cover, the heroin business picked up fast after the war. The number of heroin addicts tripled to at least 60,000 by 1952, and at least 150,000 by the time Lucky Luciano died of a heart attack. In the 15 or so years that had passed since World War II ended, heroin had moved from a blip on the criminal radar to becoming one of organized crime's biggest moneymakers. And the 1960s would see it explode into the biggest windfall of profits the underworld had ever seen. More money, more addicts, more corruption.
This, according to the Knapp Commission investigators who filmed it, is a New York City policeman getting paid off, taking bribe money. The patrolman's name is William Phillips. The commission confronted him with the evidence and got him to agree to be an undercover agent. He was also the first witness at this week's public hearings. It wasn't just him, he said, it was everybody.
What percentage of the plainclothesmen assigned to the division, to the 6th Division at that time, do you feel participated in the PAT?
Everyone to my knowledge.
Everyone?
Everyone.
Michael Levine was born and raised in the Bronx, one of the first places hit by the slowly advancing tsunami of illegal drugs coming into America. After joining the military, he became possibly the most successful undercover agent in DEA history.
You already were finding junkies dead. This is the 50s, and nobody really knew where this was going, but they were there, and you knew what junkies were. You knew all about it. You could see them. You could spot them on the street. And they were pretty much, little by little, they were all over the place.
Ground zero for heroin in America was Harlem, New York, and its Black and Puerto Rican residents were the primary victims for America's first drug epidemic.
The only thing that united Italians and Puerto Ricans was the use of drugs.
The traffic starts in Manhattan, more readily obtainable in Manhattan, especially in the Harlem area.
You know, later I went to the hard narcotic smuggling section of customs. That's when I started getting a little bit of an education and understanding that all the heroin was coming from Italian sources. I got a real up-close view of how that whole scene worked. The French connection into Harlem.
In the American mythology, the 1950s and early 60s are the golden age, the baby boom, new suburbs, low crime. But it was also a time of hidden violence and tremendous corruption.
Federal narcotic agents realize that they're in a position where individually they can make a lot of money off the drug trade, actually control the drug trade itself. As investigators, they can decide who they want to set up. They actually go into business for themselves, selling heroin. And what happened in New York in the 1950s and the 1960s is that the agents started competing with each other to make cases and also to control the trafficking that they were involved with themselves.
Arrest for unlawful possession of needles and unlawful possession of heroin.
And they were killing each other's informants. There were 28 documented informant murders. They were ripping off drug traffickers. They were trafficking in drugs themselves.
By 1968, the corruption of the FBN, especially the informant murders perpetrated by the narcotics agents themselves, led to congressional hearings, and President Richard Nixon actually disbanded the FBN, replacing it with the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. A truly watershed moment in the war on drugs.
President Nixon today asked Congress to let him set up a single agency in the Justice Department to fight the war on drugs.
To this day, the records from the congressional hearings on FBN informant murders are still sealed by order of the federal government. When the Nazis conquered France, they allowed a large part of southern France to remain semi-independent as a puppet state. Its capital was the spa town of Vichy. The Vichy French had responsibilities to the Nazis, and they set up a Gestapo-like force called the Carlinga. And the Carlinga was full of Corsican gangsters that used their powers to rob and steal from the population. Once the war ended, many of the Carlinga were executed by General Charles de Gaulle's new French government, but some of them escaped to South America. One of these Carlinga veterans was a Corsican named Auguste Record. Sentenced to death in absentia by the French court for collaborating with the Nazi regime, he fled across the Atlantic after the war and set himself up as a pimp in Argentina. After getting in legal trouble there, he found a more lucrative business, acting as a broker for French heroin smugglers and American buyers like the Mafia, as well as Cubans and others.
Auguste Record was an escaped Nazi collaborator from France who was part of the rat line that was protected by CIA and relocated in South America. He went to Paraguay, where he pretty much set up an empire.
According to the feds, Auguste Record started sending dope to the States in 1965, and he apparently sent his first 1,300 pounds of heroin without losing a single gram. This was probably no coincidence, the exact same time period when drug consumption was exploding in America. Record's billion-dollar insight was to route the heroin from France into South America first, since the routes from France to the United States were hot.
He may have been the first to be sending both heroin and cocaine in mixed shipments. There was one really big case that I got involved in. It was where heroin and cocaine was smuggled into large amounts of it, was smuggled into the U.S. They called it the picture frame case. They had these very expensive frames and paintings, and inside the frames was mixed shipments of cocaine and heroin. And the smuggler in that case, he was an internationally known chess champion, which all later became part of the Auguste Record indictment, all of this. I got involved in one or two of the really big ones. Record was like a guy sitting back and moving stuff over 3 continents. An enormous amount of different cases and different players in every different part of the world that evolved into what the prosecutor in New York called the Triangle of Death. The prosecutor had a map of the globe. When he would document a drug shipment or a money transfer, they had different colored pins. And then a homicide, they would call a black pin. So they were linked to so many homicides in part of this conspiracy that the black pins formed a triangle from Europe across South America down into the U.S. Yeah, we brought some of them in from Brazil, and I was assigned to spend a month or two debriefing Claude Pasteur. The French are implicitly trustworthy. They trusted each other in their organization. When you got outside and you dealt with the Italian Mafia, you couldn't trust them.
The so-called French Connection, run by Corsicans like Auguste Record, was one of the most tightly knit, dangerous, and well-run criminal operations of all time. Michael Levine was assigned to guard Richard Burdine, a member of Record's organization who acted as controller, responsible for receiving and delivering huge loads of heroin in the U.S. when Burdine was arrested and turned informant.
Burdine, I think, pled guilty to 1,000 kilos of heroin. Burdine was a guy, he looked like Tom Jones, the singer. He was a very handsome guy, traveled with an entire wardrobe, and he always had 10,000 cash with him. His women, well, just, in fact, because when he was working for us, we brought some of his women up to the hotel room. And they were great beauties, that was Burdine. He was still living the high life as an informant. Burdine would be told that drugs were coming in a car, and he was responsible for moving the drugs from the car to the Italian Mafia. He would leave the money. He would get the money from the Italians, and he would leave it in a hotel room, and somebody else would pick it up who he didn't know. From the money, he would take to keep his bankroll replenished, so he's always walking around with at least 10,000. He would take as much, and he would leave a note or whatever he did then that I took X thousands of dollars. I said, well, when would you get paid? He said, oh, they would, it was good. It was like in the bank. He would get an accounting when he got back to France, get everything he wanted, everything he had earned, so to speak.
In New York, U.S. Customs announced today that it has smashed a 5-nation heroin smuggling ring, which it called the largest in American history.
War criminal Auguste Record was arrested in 1970 in Paraguay, where he continued to run his operation with the protection of Paraguay's government for over a year from his jail cell. After being threatened with serious economic sanctions, Paraguay eventually extradited Record to the U.S., but he was sentenced to a mere 20 years in prison for being one of history's biggest drug dealers.
Auguste Record, considered the biggest heroin trafficker ever brought to justice in the United States, today was sentenced to a maximum of 20 years in federal prison. Record, a Frenchman who worked out of Paraguay, was charged in New York with smuggling into the United States a ton of narcotics a year.
Auguste Record only served 10 years in prison. He was released during Ronald Reagan's presidency in 1982, an amazingly short prison term for the man that helped fuel the great American heroin epidemic. Perhaps it was his reward for keeping quiet about the American government's role in the international drug trade.
We've turned the corner on drug addiction in the United States. Drug addiction in the United States is under control.
As far as I hear, in the schools they're selling drugs for $1.
Many people in the inner cities used the flood of heroin on American streets to find temporary solace from the pains of life, and many soldiers began using hard drugs in Vietnam as a way to cope with the horrors of war.
It's these youngsters who come from the ghetto, who have become completely disillusioned with our society.
You didn't say nothing about that little infraction when I was over there fighting and killing people. The majority of my friends from Brownsville, Harlem, and Memphis style. Some of them don't have no motherfucking waist from down to up. Some of them can't see. Some of them are just shell shocked. You dig it out? Lucky I got a Chinese-made rifle bullet in my make me feel like I want to kill every make me go over there. Every motherfucker who said I had to go. That goes from the who put the stamp on the letter, who sent me the token, to the bus that took me to Fort Dix. Every single one of them motherfuckers. That's how it makes me feel.
And now we come back to the beginning of our story, the Vietnam War and how it created America's first great drug epidemic. Many of the new wave of American heroin addicts had gotten addicted in the Vietnam War. After all, war is hell, and what better relief than a needle in your arm?
In New York City, there are 300,000 Vietnam-era veterans, and 40,000 of them are addicts. Most of them began using heroin, barbiturates, and amphetamines in Vietnam.
Every man leaving South Vietnam now is tested for heroin addiction.